Hey guys, Naz here. Today I'm going to be taking you through how I patterned and made this raptor. So you can make it in any colour you want. I decided to make it look like a particularly clever girl that you might know of, but I'm really happy with how this one came out. It's a relatively easy pattern to put together, it's not too tricky. A lot of the parts are separate, so you just have to know how to do a basic ladder stitch. There are plenty of tutorials on how to do a ladder stitch online if you haven't done one before, but I'm hoping that you guys will be able to put one of these together fairly easily and make your own custom raptors. I'm hoping that this will also be useful for those of you who are wanting to make any sort of dinosaur or even like a bipedal dragon. I think that this will be a really versatile pattern for a lot of uses. I haven't really seen too many patterns out there like this in the wild, I guess. So let's get started. So obviously you can't really go out and get photographs of real life raptors, so what I did is I looked at a bunch of references online and sort of drew my own profile image of a raptor that I wanted to create. You can absolutely sort of edit yours to however you want. I also sort of studied images of their head shape, or sort of the artistic interpretation of their head shape. It's pretty typical of a lot of creatures. It's sort of narrow at the front of the face and then sort of like a V shape going up the back of the head and having sort of a wider jowl at the back of the head. So pretty much all I did was like sketch my idea of what the head was going to look like from the front, and really all you need to know is that the nose is going to be thin and the back of the head is going to be thick for when we generate our gussets. We'll also include like a little eyebrow ridge that's pretty typical of a lot of dragon and dinosaur patterns or lizards, fairly similar to what we added last month on the gecko pattern. So to start off with, I'm just going to do a basic overview of all the different parts that we're going to pattern. As I mentioned earlier, it's not too difficult. We're going to be patterning the head with two side pieces, a gusset running all through all around the head. We're going to pattern the body that includes the neck and the tail, which is very simple, with a gusset running along the front. We're going to pattern our arms and our legs separately. And then we're going to also pattern our hands as a separate piece, and we're going to pattern a toe for each side of our leg as a separate piece as well, just because they have those really sort of 3D toes. So we're going to have the hooked one that sits on the inside and sort of the standard toe that sits on the outside, and there's my very well drawn hand. So we're going to pattern that separately so that it can run sort of on a different plane. So the arm section is going to go up and down and the hand is going to go side to side, so we can have that claw shape. So here's just a brief description of kind of how we're going to pattern the head. We're going to have our two side pieces in blue. We're going to have two sort of little chunk shapes for the eyebrows, and then we're going to have a gusset, which is a long strip of fabric that goes between all of those, so all the way around, and it's going to look something like an hourglass. So it is thicker at the back of the head and thinner where it's going to meet with the nose. So those are essentially roughly what our head pieces are going to look like. So now we'll go ahead and we'll start patterning them. So the first thing we're going to pattern is the body, neck and tail, because that's the largest piece. Very simple, we're just going to be patterning two side pieces that are essentially a trace over of the neck, body and tail piece that we see here. Then we're going to be adding some markers along sort of at the start of the, I guess under the chin where the neck starts. The gusset is going to start there, run down her chest and sort of end I guess where her body starts to become her tail. So we're going to mark key areas. So I'm just going to put in a few key points along this line that our gusset is going to follow, and then we're going to use that to generate our gusset that is going to sort of spread out her neck, chest and sort of between her legs sort of thing. So if you haven't already watched me pattern a gusset a gazillion times, I'll take you quickly through how I do it again. So you can see we have point 1, point 2, point 3, point 4. Point 1 is where the gusset is going to start, point 4 is where the gusset is going to end. I'm just going to draw a straight line, approximately the length that I think the gusset is going to be. We'll definitely have to edit this as we go on. And I'm just going to sort of drag this along the bottom part of our side body piece and just sort of make sure that we have our length matching up with the length that is going to be. So you can start at point 1 at the top of your straight line, and then you're sort of going to shimmy it down till it reaches point 2 running along that edge. mark where point 2 is going to be, and keep following along until you get to point 4 and put a mark at point 4. Then we're going to bring it back so it's perfectly vertical, and we're going to sort of guesstimate how wide we want our gusset at each of these key points. So point 1 is going to be the top of the neck, so that's not going to be massively wide, just sort of a medium width. Then at point 2, her chest, we probably want it to be maybe a little bit wider. Then as it sort of tapers to point 3 and point 4, all the reference images I saw of raptors had them quite skinny in that area, so you're going to taper it down to sort of a long triangle. By the time you reach point 4, because we're going to be integrating this with the sort of the side tail pieces, it's going to abruptly end, and then the tail will continue on just being made of that side body piece. You want that to be quite narrow and tapered at the end. You don't want to all of a sudden have like a very blunt triangle at the end. You want it to ease in and be quite narrow by the time it reaches that point 4 of your gusset. And that's pretty much how we're going to pattern her gusset for her body here. Really just guesstimating how wide you need it to be is a matter of practice. I've done these a gazillion times, but try and make it a bit thinner than you think it's going to need to be, because we're going to have the nap or the sort of fur direction of our minky running downwards if this piece was viewed vertically. And we want to make sure that when the minky stretches, because it stretches horizontally, it doesn't make that gusset too wide. So try and keep your gusset on the skinnier side if you're unsure, but definitely you can do a test and see if your sort of test gusset is the correct width. If it's not, then go back and edit the pattern, remake it again until you've got the correct width for your raptor or dinosaur or whatever you happen to be making. So let's move on to the next largest part of our pattern, and that is sort of the back leg and thigh area. We're going to pattern this all as one piece. It's essentially going to look like what my sketch looks like here. We're just going to make a couple of little tweaks to it. But what I'm doing is I'm creating the thigh, the leg, and the sort of middle toe out of the 3 is all going to be one piece, and then the outer toe is going to be separate and they'll be hand sewn on using a ladder stitch. So I'm just going to go ahead and trace over the leg as you see here. Then one thing that we're going to do is we're going to essentially do the opposite of crouching. I don't know, I guess you would extend the leg at the joints, because this raptor here is quite front heavy, quite top heavy, and her legs are quite skinny. When her weight comes down, when you've stuffed the plush onto the legs, they're naturally going to want to sort of crouch under that weight, because it's kind of like, oh, like the weight will be bearing down on that skinny leg, so it is going to compress our leg pattern. So what I like to do is I like to sort of imagine, you know, the opposite of crouching. So you're slightly reaching those joints out a little bit. You don't need to go too far, just a little bit, and that will sort of help us compensate for that weight that is going to be pushing down on our leg. Now for this pattern in particular, I chose to wire the legs. You aren't going to really be able to have this pattern stand at all if you don't have any sort of wire or support in the legs, because they're just so thin and her body is so large. So that is something to consider. You could make it without any wire by potentially making the legs a lot thicker if you're making like a more stylized chibi plush, or you could choose to just not have wire in and then stipulate, you know, to whoever's getting it that this plush is not going to be able to stand. It's going to kind of have noodle legs. So that's kind of the price you pay for having more accurate skinny legs in this sort of scenario. So to save ourselves from drawing the toe from scratch, we're going to make a copy of our leg, and all I'm doing is sort of drawing the upper half of the toe how I would want it to sit on the base of the leg. So really I just drew like this stretched out triangle shape, kind of looking at references of how their toes sort of merge into that central leg. So that's going to be our outside toes, and you're just going to have, you know, for one toe of this you'll have one piece of that pattern facing in each direction. You'll sew it all the way around, stuff it, and then we're going to be hand stitching that using a ladder stitch to that sort of central beam leg. I think I was considering putting a dart at the top of this leg, but I changed my mind. It didn't really need it. It was thick enough as it was on the final plush. Now to do the inside toe, which is more that hook shape. I struggled a little bit to get the shape right, just because it's kind of an awkward bean kind of banana shape, so I ended up doing the same thing. I made a copy of the leg, and eventually I just kept scribbling, looking up some references until I could get a rough idea of how that hooked toe that sits on the inside is going to be. But essentially you're just doing what we did just then, making a copy of the leg, drawing your hooked toe how you would want it to be, and making that a separate pattern in itself. So now we're going to pattern sort of the shoulder and the upper arm. It's going to stop at the wrist. Again, you're just really tracing the pattern that I've drawn out earlier, the sketch that I've drawn out earlier. I don't really make too many tweaks. I'm going to just sort of thicken her arm out a little bit because my sketch was a little skinny. Then I'm going to add a dart to the top of her shoulder because I really want that to sort of puff out and really look like a shoulder. So I'm just going to quickly draw in a dart here. If you don't know how to pattern darts, I have a couple of tutorials on how to do it. There's a basic one that shows the method that I'm using here, and then I have also a tutorial on patterning complex darts if that's something that you would like to do. But I'm just going to pop in a little dart at the top here, and that's really going to puff out our shoulder and make it look much more believable. So here I am just going ahead and patterning sort of the curved inner toe for the raptor. I'm going to make a copy and then sort of try and interpret how that's going to both attach to the leg and hook upwards. I had a fair bit of difficulty with drawing this. Drawing's not really my speciality, so you can see that at one point the clip is going to change. That's when I looked at references and copied the shape off there because I couldn't work out how to draw this stupid flaccid bean shape by myself, so I just sketched it over the top of some raptor images that I was looking at, and eventually got a sort of bean shape, or like a musical note shape, that ended up working quite well. So don't be afraid to look at references. Don't expect yourself to know how every part of every animal looks all the time. There's absolutely no problem with using references to make sure that all your shapes are correct. So we're on the home stretch now. We've nearly patterned all of her. The last thing that we need to pattern, apart from her claws, which are very straightforward, is her head. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to trace the profile of her head shape that you can see here. This is just a sketch, just a very generic sort of raptor or animal horse kind of head shape. I'm just going to trace that. I'm then going to add in some eyebrows at a later time. I think I went ahead and explained the gusset before I actually added those in, but we're going to pattern the gusset for the head now. So I'm just adding in all those key points. We're going to start and stop our gusset at the bottom there because that won't really be visible when people are viewing the plush. So think of it like a giant hourglass shape, and the top of the hourglass and the bottom of the hourglass get sewn together to create like a loop of fabric that is going to go between two of these sort of side egg head-shaped pieces. So I go ahead and I mark the numbers on all of those points that I've already put in. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then back to 1. Before I generate the gusset, I all of a sudden had a moment of realization that I forgot to add her eyebrows in. So between point 4 and point 3, I'm just going to add like a little eyebrow arch, and that's just going to give her that really dinosaur, dragon kind, lizard kind of shape. So this is exactly the same as what we patterned when I made the leopard gecko last month, if you guys watched that one. But yeah, you're just going to add in that little rise. We're going to be using that to pattern like an interior section of the eyebrow. So it'll be kind of like a little quarter sphere shape, like a little banana shape that is going to sew against that eyebrow ridge. And then the gusset will go between that and the opposite side, and that's just really going to pop that eyebrow out and give a really cool lizardy look. So what we're going to do now is we're going to pattern sort of the inner part of our eyebrow. So if you imagine that head shape that we just patterned before, that's all one piece, like an outer piece. This is like a little chunk that is going to get sewn to the top of this little banana shape, is going to get sewn to the top of the eyebrow ridge that we drew on our outer piece, and then the bottom of the banana shape is going to be sewn against the gusset along with the rest of the head shape that we have patterned here. So it's very simple. I just make a copy of the side of the head, draw in that little banana shape, and then erase the rest. So you can see here, I'm just going to try and do a little drawing to explain. You have our outer side pieces, like the outer head. Then we have these little banana pieces that are going to sit on the inside of these eyebrow ridges, so that's sort of looking through the pattern there. And then our gusset is going to go between all of that all the way around. So now we're going to actually pattern our gusset. As we did before, draw a long straight line, roughly the length that you think that the distance is going to be, sort of around the perimeter of your head. I'm just going to mark the starting point, and then I'm going to shimmy it around our side headpiece, starting at 1, going up to 2, then 3, etc. And you're just going to mark little notches whenever you come up to one of those points, and you can even write like, this is point number 1, this is point number 2, etc, etc. One thing that I did remember to turn on in a minute is you need to leave your eyebrow in place, because we're going to travel starting at point 3. We're going to follow the underside of the banana and then go back to point 4 and then start traveling around the rest of the face again. So it's kind of like the banana creates a little wedge outwards, so we're going to go around the head, then to the point of the wedge where the wedge starts, we're going to follow the outside of the wedge, which is the bottom of the banana as we're looking here, and then we'll meet back again sort of at that point 4 there, and then go back around the head. And then it's just a matter of bringing this back to vertical and guesstimating how wide you want your gusset to be at every single one of these key points that we've put in. So from the diagrams that we drew earlier, we know that point 5, 6 and 7, which is where the nose is, we want those to be quite thin, and we want it to get wider and wider till point 2 would be the widest part. So you're kind of just adjusting how your hourglass is going to be and sort of the width of each element of your hourglass. But yeah, as I mentioned earlier, it's just something that you get better with practice. I'll go ahead and just draw a bunch of horizontal lines so that they'll all meet up with our exterior sort of pattern, and then I'll just go ahead and draw straight lines. You don't really need to put a separate point in for every single point. I'm just going to say, like, I want point 1 to be approximately this wide, then I know 5, 6, 7 are thin, and then I know that we come back to point 1, which is under the chin, so that needs to be the same as the top of the hourglass needs to be the same as the bottom of the hourglass, essentially. Also at point 3 and 4, I'm just taking out kind of like a little half moon shape, and that's going to pull our eyebrow inwards. You do this when you're doing something either like these eyebrows, or you'll do it if you're patterning like the armpit of like a quadrupedal character like a dog or a horse. So it stops things from splaying out, it just tucks them in just that little bit, and it's something that I've just found you need to do when you're adding eyebrows on sort of dinosaur or dragon characters like this. So I've gone ahead and because I only patterned half of the gusset, I went ahead and flipped it and made it sort of a seamless piece. You want it to be really symmetrical. You don't want to have a gusset that's wonky unless you're patterning an asymmetrical pattern. I have a tutorial on doing that, but that's not really something that you would do on a head. So as long as it's nice and symmetrical, at that point you can also make it a little bit thinner or thicker depending on how you think it needs to be, but I just eyeball it out of experience what I think it will need to be. So that's just something that will get much, much easier the more sort of gussets that you draft as you create more and more patterns for yourself. So the last thing that we need to pattern is our claws. You can make them small and skinny, or you can make them really hooked and nasty looking, whatever you'd like. I sort of just included the generic claws that I patterned in the digital pattern that you'll get along with this tutorial. But essentially I tend to pattern my claws longer horizontally than I think that they will need to be, because you can always cut off like the back of your claw to make it shorter, but once you've gone ahead and sewn all of them, you can't really make it longer. Also, when you're sewing the tip of your claw, or with any sort of V shape in Minky, you want to blunt off the edge and sort of instead of sewing a V, sew sort of like a U shape, and that just makes sure that the Minky doesn't get too compressed when it's bunched up on the interior of the end of your claw when you turn it inside out. I think I ended up making that little claw just a little bit bigger. They were quite tricky because these fingers are very thin, and making very tiny claws out of Minky is quite difficult because it is such a puffy fabric. It's going to when you turn it inside out, be quite difficult to turn out very thin sort of pointed shapes. So always try and make your claws maybe a little bit bigger and longer than you think that they're going to need to be, especially on tiny character like hands and claws like this. If you upscaled this pattern, it would be much easier to turn those little claws inside out. But that's essentially our whole pattern, I'm pretty sure. So now we can get on to sewing it together. So here we have all the pieces cut out that we're going to need. I cut them out of Minky. I just use like a platinum silver. So your first piece on the left here is our head gusset, so we only need one. We also have our body gusset, we only need one. Here's our side body pieces, we need two, so one facing in each direction. We need two of our bananas, mirrored, so facing each direction, two of each of our side head pieces. We need, because we're doing two legs, we need four of them. Because we're doing two arms, we need four of those, obviously mirrored, 50% mirrored one way. Then we have our hands, same there, we got four, same for our toes, so that's our outer toes, and there's our inner hooked toes. I didn't film me sewing together the claws because I ended up sewing them in my embroidery hoop because there was just lots and lots of them. But essentially you just need two for each claw and then sewing them together. So the first thing we're going to sew is we're going to sew our head gusset at the start and end, so the top of our hourglass to the bottom of the hourglass, leaving a little gap to add our stuffing through. Then we're going to sew our side body pieces together, and you're going to sew from sort of the top of the neck all the way around to the end of the tail, to the under the tail, and you want to leave that whole section that we patterned where the gusset is going to go clear. So you're going to pattern all the way along here and then stop there where that little mark is, because our gusset is going to take up the rest of that space. We're going to sew all the way around our legs. You can just leave a little section to turn it inside out and stuff. We're going to sew our bananas onto our eyebrow ridges, so we're just going to lay the right sides together, and you're only sewing the top of the banana. So start at the tip, end at the tip. You're not sewing the bottom of the banana. The next thing we can sew is all these darts here on our shoulders. Once we've sewn the darts, we can sew the arms together, just leaving the bottom of the arm open to turn inside out and put our stuffing through. So do that for both of your arms. For our toes, very simple. Put one toe with its matching toe, sew all the way around, leaving a little gap to put your stuffing through, but that's pretty much it. The hands, you're going to sew all the way around, leaving the top open to turn inside out and put stuffing through, and that's going to be ladder stitched onto the wrist of our arm. Then the final thing you're going to do is you're going to sew this gusset, this strip of fabric, between our two sides of our body piece. So it's going to start at the bottom of the neck and end sort of where the rump meets the tail. So you can see here we've sewn on our bananas, that's what it looks like. We've sewn our hourglass, so it's like one continuous loop, and you want to match up your points on your hourglass to the points on the side of your head. So where the hourglass starts and stops is at that bottom part that has like that little triangle, and then you're going to match up all the outer pieces and sew them together. So here you can see I've sewn and stuffed almost everything. I've pinned our head onto our neck. I've left a little opening to stuff the head sort of under where our hourglass starts and stops. I've sewn our legs together. I've sewn the arms and the toes together. I've sewn the hands with the fingers. I try to use a smaller stitch for that. So you can see here, this is roughly what the toes are going to look like. You're just going to go ahead and ladder stitch them to that central piece. As I mentioned earlier, you probably should add wire if you're going to want those legs to not sort of crumple under their noodle shape. So here's what the hands look like. I've added some very thin gauge wire to each of the fingers so that I can curl them. They're going to sit, roughly on the shoulder, and the legs are going to sit roughly, where the rump is, sort of thing. So you can pin those on, and you're just going to use a ladder stitch to attach the hand to the wrist, the shoulder to the body, the thigh of the leg to the body, the head to the neck, etc, etc, and your toes to that sort of central leg. I used some acrylic paints to paint the back of some acrylic half domes or capuchons. You can find these on eBay, just search either glass or acrylic half domes. These are 1.5 centimeters wide, I think, and they were just the right size for her eyes there. And make sure that when you're painting, you paint obviously your pupil first and then you work backwards in your layers of colours. So here you can see what she looks like all sewn together. I've used a ladder stitch to attach everything. I've also sewn all her claws and ladder stitched them on. So she's all put together. Now we're going to be doing some finishing details on her. As you can see here, she can stand up because I put wire in her legs, so the wire runs from her toe up the leg, across the body, so through the body and down through the other leg into the other opposite toe. So obviously she can't really stand by herself without leaning on something because she is so top heavy. I guess raptors would have like obviously muscle and stuff that would end up holding their body weight, which this girl doesn't have. So this plush will probably need to lean against something. You could even make her a little prop, but here I've just got her leaning against a cup. You can either lean her with her hands or lean her with her nose against something so that she can stand up nicely. So now we're going to work on installing our glass eyes. If you want a lot more of a detailed explanation of how I painted and installed the glass eyes, check out the gecko patterning tutorial that I released last month. I went into a lot more depth. It just takes a lot of time for me to sort of re-explain everything all over again. But essentially you've painted the backs of your eyes, they're nice and dry. Now we're going to sort of make cavities for our eyes to sit in. If we just stuck them on the edge of her face here, it's going to be kind of ballooned out. She's going to have a bit of a fish-eyed look. So I'm just taking a doll needle and I'm going from side to side where the eyes are going to sit and sort of pinching the fabric and the stuffing inwards to create like a little divot or a little cavity where our eyes are going to sit, and that just makes them look a lot more natural. It looks like they're sort of embedded in the face rather than just being stuck on the outside of this shape. So I'm just going where our eyes are going to sit back and forward a bunch of times. It's not really going to matter you know, visually you're not going to be able to see the thread because our eyes are going to be glued over these points that we're going side to side from. And when you're finished doing that, sort of testing the fit and position of the eyes in these cavities, you can go ahead and just tie a little knot. And as I said before, our eyes are going to be glued over the top, so you're not going to see the knot if you make sure to tie it exactly where your eye is going to be placed. So after we've made the cavity, we're going to work on gluing our eyes in place. Because these are acrylic, they aren't really abrasive enough for a glue to sort of bite into the acrylic. So what we're going to do is I'm going to use a quality hot glue and I'm going to put a fairly large blob on the back of the eye. Then I'm going to squish it into the eye cavity so that this big glob is going to sort of push and sort of wrap around the outside of the eye. This is fine because we're going to be putting eyelids on her, so if you can sort of have the glue wrap around, it'll sort of make like a casing for holding the eye, because it's really not, glue's not going to grip onto the acrylic here. It'll grip onto the minky because the minky is sort of porous, but yeah, it's not going to grip onto the smooth surface of this glass eye. You can obviously use embroidery, or you can use sort of a doll eye, or anything that you would like depending on what style you're going for. I just really like these little realistic eyes. They're fun to paint and sort of give a realistic animal look to whatever you happen to be making. Make sure that your eyes are sort of aligned properly and you don't have a sort of derpy rotation going on with them. These eyes that I'm doing here are a bit more delicate because if you did try substantially to try and pick them off or rip them off, they could come off. So I would only recommend this if it's going to an adult that is sort of aware that this is more of a collector's item and not something to be played with by kids or thrown around or treated roughly, that sort of thing. So just something to keep in mind with what eye style you're going to go with. So I've just gone ahead and I found a little scrap piece of the silver minky that we're using to make her. I'm just cutting a couple of little banana shapes that are going to form her upper eyelids. I did try to see if she would look good with both upper and lower eyelids, but I thought that she looked nice just with the upper ones. It really depends on your personal taste. I think when you add two, the upper and lower eyelid, it makes them look more realistic, and on some animals it can kind of make them look squinty. So just see what you prefer. I didn't include a pattern for this sort of banana shape. It is literally a banana the width of the eye, just like a little curvy little shape. So just cut out a piece of minky, put it against the face, wrap it around the top of that eye and see if that's the kind of shape that you would like. And in the previous tutorial that I did this with the gecko, we actually sewed eyelids with two sides to each eyelid, but those eyes were much larger than these. These eyes are quite tiny. So what I'm doing is I'm just cutting out the piece of minky and I'm hot gluing it to the top of the eye, making sure that it's binding to the minky of the face, not just to the acrylic of the eye. So this can be a little bit fiddly, but it is good for tiny eyes like this, or if you wanted to just really quickly put some eyelids on this character. The size of these eyes here, they're just too small for me to sew a double-sided eyelid. They would just be way too thick and it wouldn't work. So in this scenario, it's fine to glue on your little eyelid here, and when you're gluing it on, obviously be careful not to burn yourself, but just take care and maybe use something like a sewing pin to push it against the minky of the face, just so that you're not touching that hot glue, but there's no hot glue visible after you've laid it down and pushed it into where you want that eyelid to be. So here I am, I've just added like a strip of hot glue along the back of the eyelid and placing it on her face and just sort of mushing it down. Here's having a look at what the lower eyelid would look like, but I didn't really like that. So once I'm happy with the shape, I'm happy with the placement, add your little bit of hot glue all along the strip, being careful, and put it in place and just hold your breath and hope that you get it into the correct position. Just sort of manipulate it into the correct spot, making sure you push any sort of beads of glue underneath so that you don't have beads of glue visible, and just repeat that from the other side. The second side might be a little bit trickier because you kind of want to make sure that they're symmetrical. You don't want one eyelid to be vastly on a different angle than the other. You can also take into consideration the angle of your top eyelid, like if it's leaning a bit forward, that might make her look a bit angrier, or if it's leaning backwards, it might make her look a bit dopier or a bit sad or something like that. So just something to keep in mind. You can really create a lot of different emotion with how you attach those eyelids onto your character. So I closed my curtains so that you guys could get a bit of a better look without that backlight. You can see what her eyes look like. The glass eyes have that neat effect where they sort of look like they're following you around, but a really cool look. And the last thing that we need to do is add her smile, and that's pretty much it. You can obviously, as you're making this, you can sew her in different colours, or you can use applique or just general sewing different pieces together to give her different patterns. But in this scenario I ended up airbrushing her just because it's a nice and quick way to get a realistic look on your plush. So all I'm doing is thread sculpting her mouth. So thread sculpting is just taking a very long needle, doubling up your thread, and you're going from one side of the plush to the other several times and sort of pulling tight as you do each layer in a straight line. So you can see here that I'm sort of starting at one point of the mouth, ending on the opposite point of that mouth, and just pulling this tight until it gives her like a little smile. And you can break this up into separate sections. So here I'm doing the section that sort of runs from underneath her eye around the front of her muzzle and to the other side underneath the opposite eye. And I went and did this a few times just to make sure it's nice and secure. Then I went ahead and gave her like a little zigzag mouth at the back. So you're just working in straight sections, going from one side to the other. There's a heap of tutorials about this on YouTube if you just search thread sculpting or thread sculpting plush or something like that. It should come up with a fair few tutorials on how to do this, but it's fairly simple as long as you don't go too crazy with your shapes. You can definitely customize what kind of mouth you want her to have. I sort of experimented with just giving her like a little cute smile, but this is the shape that I ended up with liking overall, and it wasn't too difficult to do. So I'm just going to go ahead, make sure that everything is symmetrical. You can see that I've added the pins. I used a ruler or a little measurer to make sure that both my pin points were the same on each side so that everything would be symmetrical. The smile would be the same on one side as it is the other, and just you know, going through that process, customizing your smile. You can even bring your needle back around, for example, to the front of her nose and do like a little loop over the front piece of thread, just in case someone's sort of rough with handling it, they don't sort of hook their finger behind it and pull it down. So you can just bring it back and just do like, if the thread's running horizontally, you do like a little vertical hop over that long piece of thread just to hold it in place, to pin it in place, to make sure that it's not going to go anywhere if anyone touches this plush or accidentally she gets caught on something and that thread is inclined to get pulled down and out of position. I did redo this once because I noticed that the knot that I put in the thread accidentally got pulled through into her smile, so the thread was, the knot of the thread was actually on the side of her face, which I didn't want. So I redid this once. Don't be worried if you have to redo this once or twice. It is a little bit complicated to get that smile exactly how you would like it to be. I didn't include any reference for adding the smile in the actual pattern. That's something that you'll have to sort of freehand yourself. You can use mine as a reference, so make sure you put your pins in there to sort of mark where you want the different sort of straight sections of your smile to start and end, and just work from one side of the face to the other, making sure you're keeping that thread nice and tight. And here we have the finished version. I just went ahead and did a quick airbrushing paint job on her just to make her look a little bit extra clever, and just added in some scale sort of lines on her hands and her feet, and just some markings and shadows. Made her look a little bit more realistic. So if you make your base plush in sort of a lighter minky colour, you can go ahead and airbrush all sorts of realistic patterns, or as I mentioned earlier, you could sort of use applique or just general sewing to sew those patterns into the plush before you assemble her. So I do have a couple of tutorials on airbrushing. I have a basic airbrushing tutorial and a bunch of, there's an advanced airbrushing tutorial and then some walkthroughs of me airbrushing some dragons. So they would be pretty relevant here because I go over how to add scale, texture and contour and things like that to make a particularly realistic looking dinosaur or dragon, if that's something you want to check out. But thanks so much you guys for voting for this in the poll. I get really excited now for what is going to get selected for me to make, because it gives me the chance to make things that I probably never would have made otherwise on a commission. So I was really excited to make this. I never would have thought to make a raptor, but I'm so happy with how this one came out. It's really cute. And I think this pattern should be pretty versatile for a lot of different dragons and dinosaurs and things like that. I haven't made a pattern quite like this, a sort of bipedal reptilian pattern. So I hope you find it useful. If there's any part that you're struggling with, feel free to send me a private message on Patreon or any of my social media pages, and I'll try and help you out. But anyway, let me know if you use it, and definitely tag me in any pictures you post. I'll try and share them on like Twitter and Instagram and stuff like that, because I'd really love to see your raptors. So anyway, I hope that you like this tutorial, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!